So let's cultivate our motivation. And remember that it's quite important when we generate the compassion that is a cause for bodhicitta, that compassion focuses not just on sentient beings who have explicit manifest pain, and not just on sentient beings who suffer from change, but seeing sentient beings as being under the control of afflictions and karma and not having any freedom, even if at this moment they may temporarily be experiencing worldly happiness. To be able to see them as not having any security, not having any safety, and develop the compassion that wants to alleviate them from that condition. And then use that compassion as a motivating force to aspire for full awakening in order to be best able to benefit them. So it's important that our compassion not be do you say it maudlin or sappy? Yeah. We're not feeling sorry for people. Oh, those poor beings. I want to rescue them. I want to save them. Oh, poor babies. No. Okay? Because that has a little bit of condescension in it. Yeah? We're playing the rescuer. It's not really, I feel, respecting sentient beings' potential and their capability. And it also tends to go for people who are experiencing quite overt suffering. But as soon as those people feel better, our compassion for them disappears. And when they do something that we don't like, even if they're still suffering, our compassion for them will disappear. So we have to make sure that our compassion remains steady, no matter how they treat us, and no matter whether they're experiencing worldly happiness or worldly suffering, because we want our compassion to be focused just on the fact that they're in samsara, and that situation itself is unsatisfactory, and that situation gives rise to the overt suffering as well as the suffering of change. Okay, communicating? Yeah, otherwise, like, oh, those people in this country are starving. I have so much compassion. But then when they get food and they become terrorists for our country, we don't have any compassion for them anymore. In fact, we have hatred. Mhm. Okay. So we need to make it so that our compassion is really steady, yeah, and really seeing how sentient beings struggle in samsara, whether they're overtly happy or overtly suffering, whether they're on our side or somebody else's side. Okay? And this is hard, yeah, because we have preferences and we have attachment, yeah, and we sometimes want to be needed and want to be appreciated, or we want to think of ourselves as, saving somebody else from themselves. And all of that kind of conceptualization really gets in the way of having compassion. And that's why we often get upset at the people that we thought we had compassion for. So I remember we were in the middle of page 120. Yeah, in the early 9th century. Okay, so we were stuck in the early 9th century. Okay, so many Buddhists, in the early 9th century, many Buddhist texts were translated into Tibetan, and a commission of Tibetan and Indian scholars standardized many of the technical terms and compiled the Sanskrit Tibetan glossary. Now, that would be wonderful if we had Tibetan and English masters who standardized of the technical terms with a specific vocabulary. However, that is highly unlikely. First of all, the Tibetan king was the one who mandated that. Yeah. And, I asked His Holiness one time about that, if he would just kind of do that. And his take was, well, let there be an abundance of translations and retranslations of a text. And then whichever ones are better, that's the one people will gravitate towards. Okay? But what we have right now is lots of translations, and the translators use different translation terms for technical vocabulary. And sometimes it's really hard to figure out, if you're used to one vocabulary, figuring out what this other translator is trying to say. Okay? And sometimes, because I've run across this in writing the things for His Holiness, you find two translations of the same verse, and the translations are like day and night. And you're really wondering, are these of the same verse? It's like they've got to be, but they sound really different. Okay, so I don't see any of the English translators, how to say it, coming to an agreement. Yeah, because everybody has their own reasons for translating things the way they do. And some people like these translations and their reasons, and some people like the other ones. So that's the way it is right now, and good luck to us. Yeah. Okay, however, Buddhism met with drastic persecution under the reign of King Langdharma, who reigned only 4 years, but he made a big mess in 4 years, like somebody else we know. Yeah, just in 2 years. Yeah. During this time, the monastic institutions, which were the central repositories for Buddhist learning and practice, were almost totally decimated. Okay, so here you see the monastic institutions, the role historically is the repository for practice, learning and practice. Okay, so like in India, when Nalanda and Vikramasila and so on were destroyed, it really destroyed Buddhism. Yeah. So with monastics no longer able to live together, the continuation of the Dharma from teacher to student was disrupted. Scriptures were scattered, and practice became fragmented, with a group in one place practicing sutra teachings and another group in another place practicing tantra. Okay, so here we see why monastics are important, because when teachers and students live together, you can have the transmission of the teachings from one generation to the next without interference. Okay, when you have monasteries, then the scriptures are there. They aren't scattered around everywhere, okay? And also practice is uniform in some ways because people are living together and doing the same thing. Whereas when you don't have the monasteries, the scriptures are scattered, passing Buddha, the teachings on from one generation from the next is much more difficult because you're not living in the same place. And then also, you get different groups practicing different things in different places. And, it's very hard to systematize things and get things in a uniform way. Okay? So, particularly in the case of Tibet, you had some groups practicing the sutra teachings and other groups practicing tantra. And it came to happen that they thought sutra and tantra was contradictory. And if you practice sutra, you can practice tantra. If you practice tantra, you can't practice sutra. Yeah, because they saw, for example, the precepts as contradictory. Yeah, the way of meditating as contradictory. Okay, what you meditate on, how you meditate. They couldn't put it all together, but especially the ethics part, they couldn't put it together, okay? And so it was a big mess. So in this way, people no longer knew how to practice all the various teachings in a unified manner, free of contradiction. Okay, so people who were practicing the Mahayana didn't know how to keep the Bodhisattva vows and still practice monastic ordination. Because Bodhisattva Precepts said, if it's better for sentient beings, you do it. Whereas monastic precepts were, this is it, and it doesn't matter the situation. But how do you put those two together? Okay, in a non-contradictory way, so that you're not breaking your monastic precepts and you're not breaking your bodhisattva precepts. And then you throw tantra in there, okay, and, and then it gets even more confusing for people. And you can even see that today, how many people who practice tantra, then they disparage the monastic precepts, even they disparage the bodhisattva precepts, because they don't know how to put these together in one person's practice. Okay, so this is what Atisha and Jay Rinpoche did, and really did in a very skillful way and settled a lot of that confusion. Of course, the confusion still exists, but, you do what you can. So the king Yeshe invited the great sage Atisha, who lived from 982 to 1054, to Tibet to remedy this difficult situation. So arriving in 1042, he taught extensively and to rectify the misconception that the Sutra and Tantra teachings were contradictory, Atisha wrote Lamp of the Path. So this is his very, very famous text. Okay? It's not a long text. It's quite short, actually, and it's the basis for talking about the beings of the three capacities. Okay? So the initial capacity being that person who wants happiness within samsara, either in this life or in the next life. The middle capacity being the person who's aiming for liberation from samsara. And the advanced capacity being who's aiming for full awakening to benefit all the beings. Okay? So his text, The Lamp of the Path, set the stage for delineating these three types of beings. And then when you know kind of which of the three you are and how you need to practice given the stage you're at, then things make sense. And you don't bite off more than you can chew. And you bite off what you can chew, and you know that there's more to bite off later on when you're ready to eat it. Yeah, when your mind has advanced and you have greater understanding and greater wisdom, then you know you can advance to the higher stages. But you don't get confused by trying to practice the higher stages when you don't understand them, because you're actually in kindergarten. Yeah? So it's like if you're in kindergarten and you want to learn calculus, the best way to learn calculus is not to enroll in a calculus class when you're in kindergarten. Yeah, because you're not going to, they'll talk about all these calculus terms and you'll just get confused. If you want to learn calculus, but you're in kindergarten, learn 1 + 1 = 2. And 2 + 2 = 4. And then you learn subtraction and division and multiplication. And then you get on, then you get to high school, you learn sines and cosines and some algebra and stuff like that. And then you build up your capacity and your knowledge gradually. And then calculus, you don't get confused by it, because you have all the preparation. So it's the same way for practicing the different levels of the path. Yeah? And so, Geshe-la has been talking about this the last few days too. Yeah? So it's really good to see what level we're at. So I was thinking about this, especially since I came from the ordination in Taiwan, where the full focus was on the monastic precepts, the pratimoksha precepts, the initial level of precepts we take. And of course, at the very end, then they take the Bodhisattva precepts. But they were really emphasizing, the importance of our monastic precepts. And some people kind of say, monastic precept, don't lie, don't steal, don't sleep around. Yeah. I learned that in Sunday school. I want to do something more advanced. But then they steal and they lie and they sleep around and get intoxicated, because they don't respect that level of precepts and they think they're more advanced. But then when they try and do the higher practices, they get really confused because they can't understand them well. The beauty about the pratimoksha precepts is they're not real difficult to understand. They may be it's difficult to control our mind and our speech and our body so we don't break them. But it's not too difficult to understand. When it says, don't steal, or, don't kill, it means don't take the life of any living being. Okay. Now, of course, there may be a situation where the hunter comes up the hill and says, where's the deer? And, you're not supposed to lie, but you're not supposed to kill. So what do you do in that situation? You put two and two together and you think, what is the best thing? Yeah. Yeah. Is the best thing to tell the hunter where the deer is? No. Is the best thing to distract the hunter? Duh. Yes. If you can't distract him, is it better to lie or is it better to kill the deer? Yeah. You make something up, but best yet is distract the guy. Okay? So it's not too difficult. And I think if we, put some energy, and this is why they say at the beginning, put energy into understanding the Pratimoksha precepts, your monastic precepts, 5 lay precepts. Put your energy into understanding those and practicing those, because you're more likely to have success doing that than ignoring those and going straight to the Bodhisattva and Tantric precepts. Okay? So if you practice something that is comparatively easy, then it builds up your confidence that you can keep good ethical conduct. Keeping the Bodhisattva and the Tantric precepts is much more difficult because you have to work with all sorts of shades of gray. And you can break those precepts just by the actions in your mind. Okay, whereas Pratimoksha precepts, you actually have to say or do something. So they're harder to break in that way. So if we practice what we're capable of at this time, it builds up our confidence. And then we can take the next level and we feel comfortable with it instead of getting confused. And like I said, understanding the Pratimoksha precepts is not terribly difficult, but it's not that easy to keep them because we have a berserky mind full of attachment and jealousy and arrogance and anger. And so we have to learn to subdue those very coarse states of mind, by keeping those very coarse precepts so that we can then refine the precepts and refine the mind. And we'll be more confident in doing so. Okay, is this making some sense to you? I was going to say this in the Vinaya class, but it's coming out today. But I think it makes some sense here. Okay? So, as a result of Lama Atisha, writing Lamp of a Path and showing how a person can practice both Sutra and Tantra in a systematic and non-contradictory way, knowing that it's a gradual path to adopt all these things. Okay, as a result of that, people came to understand that the monastic discipline of the Vinaya, the Bodhisattva ideals of the perfection vehicle, and the transformative practices of the Vajrayana could be practiced in a mutually complementary way when a person is qualified and understands how to do that. Monasteries were again built and the Dharma flourished in Tibet. Okay? So the building of the monasteries was very, very important in this aspect. The Buddha's teachings that were established in Tibet before Atisha, those teachings became known as the Nyingma, or Old Translation School. The new lineages of teachings that came into Tibet, beginning in the 11th century with Atisha, were called the New Translation Schools, and these slowly crystallized to form the Kadam school, which later evolved into the Gelu, but the Kadam also influenced the Kagyu and Sakya traditions. Okay? So all 4 of these traditions, the Gelu, Kagyu, Sakya, and Nyingma, all 4 of them go back to Nalanda, the monastic university in India. So the Nyingma lineage stems from both Santarakshita and Padmasambhava. Yeah, Santarakshita was a great sage and pandit at one of those, the Nalanda tradition monasteries. Yeah, Padmasambhava was a tantric yogi. The Khargya tradition came from Naropa, a great yogi who was previously an astute scholar at Nalanda. Okay, so he studied everything at Nalanda and knew the scriptures inside and out from the sutra vehicle. And then he realized, okay, he needs something that kind of went a little bit deeper. And at that point, then he went searching for a tantric master, and he found Tilopa. Okay, the Tibetan translator Marpa went to India and brought his, in other words, Naropa's lineage back to Tibet. The Sakya tradition came to Tibet via Virupa, who began as a Nalanda scholar, specializing in Chittamatra philosophy. He had many mystical experiences, and one evening the disciplinarian heard women's voices in his room. So this is not too cool in the monastery if you hear a lot of women in a monk's room at night. Opening the door, okay, the disciplinarian found a group of female tantric practitioners there. They were actually the 16 dakinis, who were highly realized female tantric practitioners of the Hevajra Tantra. But because monastic rules had been transgressed, the monk Dharmapala, which was Virupa's name before, the monk Dharmapala was expelled and became the yogi Virupa. Okay. Atisha was from Vikramasila Monastery in India, but he is considered part of the Nalanda tradition because the curriculum at the two monasteries was the same. Okay. All four Tibetan traditions present the stages of practice in the perfection vehicle, or the Sutrayana, in a similar way, as seen in their major Tibetan treatises on this topic. Okay, so here His Holiness really wants to emphasize that among the four main Tibetan traditions, there's a lot of stuff in common, and the difference lies mainly in the tantric deity they rely on. The sutra vehicles, perfection vehicle teachings are very similar. So he says in the Nyingma tradition, Longchenpa's text, Mind at Ease, and his commentary, Great Chariot, resemble Atisha's Lamp of the Path, especially in terms of the outlines and the structure of the text. Okay, the Nyingma Lama Zalpatro Rinpoche, who lived in the 19th century, wrote Words of My Perfect Teacher, which is a Lamrim text. It's a beautiful text. My teacher, Geshe Nawan Darga, used to quote that text all the time, okay? And Zapatra, he really socks it to you, you know? When people are misbehaving, he just states it right out there and doesn't pull any punches, okay? The Khargya master Gampopa authored The Ornament of Precious Liberation. The Sakya master Sakya Pandita authored Clarifying the Sage's Intent, and the Galu master Tsongkhapa composed his great treatise on the stages of the path. So these all deal with the perfection vehicle, yeah, and Sutrayana topics, and they're very, very similar. Okay. There has been a rich tradition of debate among the various branches of Tibetan Buddhism. Okay. Oh, I should say before we go on to this paragraph that each of these four major schools, many of them have sub-schools too. Okay. So in the Khargya, you have you have 4 principal sub-schools and 8 minor ones. In the Gelu, they divide into the 3 the 3 seats, In the Sakya, you have the 2 palaces, you know, the one headed by Sakya Treason, the one headed by Dr. Rinpoche. Yeah, yeah. So those are changing because it actually goes from one palace to the other. Yeah, so and in Nyingma, you have many, many different teachers and approaches. Okay, so, you know, we shouldn't think of things as like, you know, okay, there's 4 and they're all in a box and nobody strays and, you know, there's a catechism there. It's not like that. There has been a rich tradition of debate among the various branches of Tibetan Buddhism. For example, some people think that Tsongkhapa's writings about emptiness are his own creative invention. In fact, they are firmly rooted in Nagarjuna's text. He relies on Nagarjuna in his discussion of every important topic. I have found some explanations are slightly different from those of Sakya, Khargyu, and Nyingma masters, but the difference is not of great significance. So the terminology may be different, and that can cause a lot of confusion. Okay? The main difference among Tibetan traditions of Gelu, Sakya, Nyingma, and Khargyu is the principal deities they rely on in tantric practice. The Nyingma principally rely on Vajrakilaya, the Sakya on Hirvajra, the Khargyu on Chakrasamvara, the Gelu on Guyasamaja, and the Jonang on Kalachakra. However, the Gelu practice Chakrasamvara and Kalachakra too, and the other traditions practice ones from the other things as well. All of these 4, their explanations of the teachings primarily preliminary to tantric practices are very similar, and all have the preparatory practices of Guru Yoga, bodhicitta, mandala offering, prostrations, all these kind of things that you do 100,000 times. All rely on the lineages of Maitreya and Asanga for methods to cultivate love, compassion, bodhicitta, and the 6 perfections. And their elucidations of emptiness are all rooted in the works of Nagarjuna and his followers. As a great scholar and logician, Shantarakshita introduced his students to the process of using reasoning to examine the teachings. And from then until now, Tibetans have engaged in rigorous study and debate in addition to meditation. With Tibetan scholar practitioners studying, contemplating, and meditating on the words of the Buddha, as well as on the great Indian treatises and commentaries, Tibet came to uphold the complete Nalanda tradition. Okay. So I have 2 purposes, His Holiness is saying, for calling Tibetan Buddhism the Nalanda tradition. First, this shows that it is not Lamaism, a term early Western visitors to Tibet called our form of Buddhism. Okay. Now, Lamaism, and this is true, these people who knew nothing about Tibetan Buddhism came, and they saw like the Guru Puja, and they saw people prostrating to their teachers, and maybe they heard about Guru Yoga or, tantric practice or something. And so they said, this is not Buddhism. Buddhism is what they practice in Sri Lanka. This is Lamaism. They worship their lamas. Okay? And they were just looking superficially at the tradition through the viewpoint of their own misconceptions. Okay? So if you read some of these early people, what they say about Tibetan Buddhism is pretty weird. Okay? Like they're all doing magic, and all this kind of superstitious way of looking at Tibetan Buddhism, which, unfortunately, the Tibetans are not free of to this day. Yeah, and, especially like in Taiwan and China, people often look on Tibetan Buddhism as, some kind of mystical, magical something. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding. So this term, Lamaism, created much misunderstanding. Yeah, and it's completely wrong. People don't, if you don't understand properly, you say, oh, Lamaism. And you say, oh, and this is another thing His Holiness really doesn't like, is this thing of calling the Dalai Lama a God king. Yeah? And that came as a Chinese translation from a Chinese term. Okay? The Dalai Lama is not a god, and he's also not a king. So he's not the two together, a God king, okay? And again, it just creates so much misunderstanding. And it came from people, coming in, not understanding well because they don't know the language or the custom or the teachings. And then, describing whatever it is they see and spreading those misconceptions. I even remember one time, I think it was in Tennessee, I was invited to go to a college course. There was a world religion course, and they had just finished studying the Buddhist thing. And they had read, some in their college textbook. And somebody, when it came to the Q&A session, raised their hand and said, well, I heard that you people do all sorts of magic. Can you tell us about it? And I said, where did you read this? Oh, it says that in our textbook. At an American university that are supposed to be seats of, knowledge. And that's what they're teaching people about Buddhism. So I had to, explain. Yeah. So that's one reason His Holiness wants to say that Tibetan Buddhism is from the Nalanda tradition, because it shows Nalanda was, a valid monastic university. They used reasoning. It wasn't some kind of place where they did magic and mystical, something. Okay. And second, many Tibetans don't know the origin of their own teachings and practices and simply follow their own Lama or the texts written by teachers of their own monastery. So he also wants to combat the ignorance of the Tibetans themselves. Yeah, because in old Tibet, whatever valley you lived in, you went to the monastery in that valley. And you didn't know about the monasteries and the teachings in other valleys because they were too far away and you hardly went there. Okay? So they didn't know much about even the richness and the extensiveness of their own tradition. Yeah. Now it's changing a lot. Okay? They lack fuller knowledge and a wider perspective. In Nalanda, in addition to studying various Buddhist tenet systems, they also studied non-Buddhist thought. And so I think nowadays His Holiness is really speaking a lot about Indian knowledge of all the traditions, even the non-Buddhist traditions, and the importance of preserving all of that for future generations. Yeah, he isn't just talking about preserving the Buddhist traditions now. Okay, so in Nalanda, in addition to studying various Buddhist tenet systems, they also studied non-Buddhist thought, and they debated each other like mad. In this way, they developed their critical thinking and gained real knowledge. Reading just one text or learning one system doesn't bring that. Okay. And so I see here in the West, what we want is just tell me the right answer. Okay? Yeah. It's difficult to think and debate on these topics. I think, first of all, because we're educated, we want the one right answer. But even more than that, because we don't have translations of all the texts, system where the terminology is the same. So sometimes it's hard to understand even what the information is before you debate it. Okay, so you have to understand what this text is saying before you can debate it. And sometimes because of translation or whatever, the meaning of the text is not crystal clear. Okay. So having studied many texts and engaged in serious meditation, the most excellent teachers are able to give extensive explanations. Okay. You can see things from this viewpoint and that viewpoint. And this was coming up with Geshe-la, because he's from Drepung Loseling. They're the teacher of that, or the manuals, debate manuals from that monastery were written by Panchen Sonam Drakpa. So everybody learns Panchen Sonam Drakpa's views. But his views often differ from the views of Jetsunpa, Jetsun Chukyi Gyaltsen, who was the one who did the monastery text for Sarah J and for Ganden Jangse. And many of our teachers are from Sarah J, so we learned the Sarah J view. And now we're hearing Panchen Sonam Drakpa's view. And Panchen Sonam Drakpa's view sometimes doesn't correspond with that. And Jeffrey is translating the text from Drepung Gomang, which follows Jamyang Shepa. Okay, so then we have Jamyang Shepa's view in there too. Yeah. So, So, you can see with Geshe-la that he studied the views of the other ones because he can say, when you understand them, you can see that they're not that different. They're approaching things from slightly different perspectives. And that's just within the Galu tradition. Okay, when you start thinking of the difference in vocabulary for similar concepts that happen in the other Tibetan traditions, then you can really see how people can, drastically misunderstand each other. Due to the social context in India at the time of Nalanda and the other great monastic, at the time of India at the time, Nalanda and the other great monastic universities flourished, their scholar practitioners focused on refuting non-Buddhist misconceptions. So you'll see in our tenet system, our tenet text, they always start out giving you a little overview of the Samkhyas and the Jnanas and all these different people, because that's where the tradition started, with the Buddhists debating with these non-Buddhists in the great monastic universities. Okay. However, once the great majority of Tibetans became Buddhist, Tibetan scholar practitioners took it for granted that their audience was Buddhist. Okay, so they didn't teach the reasoning so much because they figured everybody already understood the Buddhist teachings. They didn't need to, put forth so much reasoning. Yeah. For these reasons, although the Indian sages wrote texts employing reasoning to refute wrong views, Atisha emphasized integrating the knowledge of Buddhist practices into daily life. So you find in the Lamrim Chenmo, in the Lojong text, you don't find a lot of reasoning because those texts were put together when it was assumed that most of the people were Buddhist in Tibet. And most of them were, except for a few people who were Muslim. Okay. So nowadays, the audience is more diverse than ever, and both reasoning to refute wrong views and practice techniques for subduing the mind need to be emphasized. So nowadays, people need both, because people nowadays, they're coming from learning science, they've learned New Age, they've learned Christianity, they've learned Muslim, Islam, and Hinduism. They come from so many different backgrounds. And so people come to Buddhism with a plethora of different views, and reasoning is really important now to establish the Buddhist viewpoint and the Buddhist worldview. Okay, so we need reasoning now. We can't just say, well, the Buddha said so, so you should believe, because everybody has a text and everybody has a leader that founded their religion. Yeah, so you can't say, well, the Buddha said so, read his sutras and just believe that, because somebody's going to say, but, Paul, wrote this in the Gospel, so you should read that, and Moses found that and he wrote that, so you should believe that, and, Muhammad found this, and so read that, and, the Hindus found this, and, everybody has their scriptures. So you can't just, quote a scripture and say that's good enough to prove something, not in a world now where there's so much communication, okay? So we need reasoning to refute wrong views now, and we also need to teach practice techniques so that people can engage in practice, and by engaging in practice, then you can begin to see that the teachings work. Okay, so we need the reasoning so people have a correct conceptual and intellectual understanding, but that's not sufficient. They also need to see, the beauty in the Dharma through practicing it. And so we need to teach practices like how to control your anger, okay, how to decrease your attachment, what to do with jealousy, how to generate loving kindness. These kinds of things we also really need to teach nowadays. Okay, so we have a big job. Yeah, and figuring out what to teach any particular audience at any particular time. Yeah, that can be dicey. Yeah, and you can't always please everybody in the audience. So, and especially nowadays when the people who come to the teachings, sometimes they've been to teachings by other teachers who have emphasized a different approach, even though the Dharma is the same. And they come to your course or retreat expecting a continuation of what they learned for the other teacher, and it's different. Yeah, and so I remember at Cloud Mountain, sometimes we would get people who had done a Vipassana retreat and spent their time watching their breath and just noting the mental factors. And then they come and I'm teaching and I'm explaining this and explaining that, and you visualize this and that. And they're going, I came here just to sit and watch my breath. I don't want so many words, I want my money back. And I said, great, go talk to the people who run the office. If it doesn't fulfill your needs, read the description before you choose a course. Yeah. But, and so this happens. So some people are more flexible than others. It's like, oh, this wasn't what I expected, but it's interesting anyway. Yeah, so I might as well stay and learn something. So, so you get all different kinds of things. Yeah, and then you get people, you're trying to assert, kind of prove the Buddhist view using logic and reasoning, and then some people get offended. It's like, oh, you're criticizing my religion. Yeah, I thought as a Buddhist you were very tolerant and you're criticizing my religion. And then you have to explain, we're not criticizing your religion. We're debating tenets to try and get at the truth. No, you're criticizing my religion and you're biased. And okay, if this doesn't meet your needs, that's fine. Find something that meets your needs. it's really difficult to know what to expect when you teach a retreat, or lead a course, because, people are coming with all sorts of things. They just finished reading, what's that guy who was telling you to walk across red hot coals? Yeah, Robbins, somebody, yeah. Yeah, Tony Robbins. So they just finished that book. Somebody else just finished the Bhagavad Gita. Somebody else just is studying Rosicrucian. And they're all, in one retreat. And you're the teacher and you're going, what in the world do I try and teach these people? Okay? And like I said, some people are quite open-minded and curious, and other people, not so much. Yeah? And they'll let you know. were some of you at those Club Mountain retreats, you remember? Sometimes people getting quite upset. What can I do? Okay. Sometimes people mistakenly think that Tibetan practice, especially Vajrayana, is a practice all to itself, separate from the rest of Buddhism. This is a very common misconception. And even in the West, when they talk about, we have 3 traditions of Buddhism: Vipassana, Zen, and Vajrayana. That is like so wrong. And you try and explain it to people. I saw at one Western Buddhist Teachers Conference, Gelag Rinpoche explained it to people, and right after he finished his talk, they said, yes, we have the 3 traditions, Vipassana, Zen, and Vajrayana. I was like, oh, God. Okay. So, yeah. Okay, so people think Vajrayana is a practice all to itself, separate from the rest of Buddhism. His Holiness says, when I first visited Thailand many years ago, some people seemed to think that Tibetan Buddhism was a different religion. And some people in Theravada circles still think that. Yeah. However, when we sat together and discussed the Vinaya, the Abbey Dharma, and such topics as the 4 truths of the Aryas, the 37 harmonies to awakening, and the 4 immeasurables, we saw that our Theravada and Tibetan Buddhist traditions have many common practices and teachings. So this is the clue. When you're with people from the Theravada tradition, talk about the things in our tradition that are in common with their tradition. Don't talk about Tantra. That's not, they may ask you about Tantra. Don't talk about it. Talk about what is common, so that, because unless people know how much we have in common, then they don't understand how Vajrayana is built on top of that. Yeah, and is related to all of that and is not separate from that. Yes, you have to talk about what's in common. Similarly, if you go talk at a Christian church, you talk about what we have in common. You talk about love and compassion and forgiveness, ethical conduct. Yeah, you don't go in and start refuting the idea of a created God when you're talking in a Christian church. That's just not skillful. Okay? Yeah? And they'll go wham in your face, okay? So this is quite important, Yeah. And then with Chinese, Korean, and many Vietnamese Buddhists, Tibetans share the monastic tradition, the Bodhisattva ethical restraints, the Sanskrit scriptures, and the practices of Amitabha, Avalokiteshvara, Samantabhadra, and Medicine Buddha. Okay? So when I'm with, in Chinese circles, this is what I talk about a lot. Especially I like talking about the Amitabha practice to them, because sometimes they don't even know the teachings in their own tradition, and for them to learn that, as well as the Amitabha teachings in the Tibetan tradition. And then, of course, Samantabhadra, Avalokiteshvara, Medicine Buddha, Bodhisattva Precepts, all this, the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Heap of Jewels Sutra, all these things, we have in common. And so to really see that. And it's very interesting in Taiwan doing that, because Venerable Damcha pointed out to me that I'm in a very unique position in Taiwan, because most of the lamas who go there, they're teaching at Dharma centers, and the people who attend those, some of them want the teachings, but some of them, like Ishu was saying the other day, they want empowerments and initiations, and they want pujas. And so, they want you to ring a bell and, blow a conch and all this kind of stuff. And the less they understand, the bigger blessing they think they get. So many people are like that. And then you get these misconceptions about Tibetan Buddhism that is just magic, because you have Zambala, the deity, for increasing wealth. And everybody wants, a wealth vase and a Zambala puja, because it'll make their business go better. But they don't want to hear that generosity is the cause of wealth. Yeah. And work with it in a karmic way. They'd rather have you do a puja that looks kind of fancy and okay. So she was pointing out that many of the lamas, are in that kind of position where they get requested for this. And then also there's been some scandals in Taiwan with Tibetan monks not acting properly. And so then, you have people criticizing His Holiness, who is impeccable in his ethical conduct, but people misunderstand Tantra because some of, people are teaching Tantra and they don't understand it, so then they criticize His Holiness. Then there's monks who misbehave, and then people gossip about Tibetan Buddhism and blah, blah, blah. And so Venerable Damcha pointed out that being a nun, I fit in with all the nuns, and I can go and teach in the nunneries. And there's 3 times as many nuns than monks in Taiwan. 3 times. Okay? So she said, I have an avenue talking to the monastics and keeping it all related to the practices that we do, the Bodhisattva practices, the common practices of Vinaya and Four Noble Truths and everything, and the Bodhisattva practices, and really making a link in that way. Yeah. And so I felt very privileged when they asked me to speak at the ordination, the day after the full ordination, to give the morning talk. It was 2 sessions, yeah, and at Luminary Institute to be able to talk. Because it's like, one avenue maybe for them, for people in Taiwan to gain a correct understanding of Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah, that we're not all kind of crazy and so on. Just a few of us are. And, no, I'm joking. But, to share what we have in common, and also because we can learn so much from them, and they can learn from us, and it becomes a very, very nice mutual exchange. And the more I go to Taiwan and the more we invite some of the masters here, the more I really see this as a really wonderful mutual exchange that we have with them. Yeah. So, then His Holiness says, when Tibetan Buddhists meet Japanese Buddhists, we discuss the bodhisattva ethical restraints and the method to generate serenity, Okay, concentration, dhyana. And sutras such as the Lotus Sutra, which is very popular in Japan. The Japanese Shingon sect practices Tantrayana, and with them we share the Yoga Tantra practices of Vajradhatu Mandala and the performance Tantra practice of Vairochana Abhisambodhi. And here we see that Tibetan Buddhist practitioners share many common points that they can discuss with all other Buddhists. For this reason, we can say that Tibetan Buddhism is a comprehensive form of Buddhism. Okay? So that's really pointing out to us when we talk to people from different branches of Buddhism, to talk about what we have in common and to learn from them about the things we have in common, before we even beginning to talk about the things that we do differently. So, for example, in the Chinese tradition, they have the Bodhisattva Vows. Some of their Bodhisattva Vows come from a Sangha, like some of our Bodhisattva Vows do, but some of them don't. So that you have two renditions. Actually, they have two renditions of the Bodhisattva Vows. We have one rendition. You can study them and you can see all the overlap, and you can also see some differences between them. But even where there's differences, the meaning is the same, okay? Then for the Japanese, they have Bodhisattva Vows too, but they're completely different. They talk about 16 Bodhisattva Vows, but some of their 16 are the Pratimoksha, the 5 lay precepts that we have. Okay, so it's very interesting to see this and to see how different people practice in different traditions without labeling one right and one wrong, and just see that Buddhism developed in different ways in different countries because of the different circumstances. So like in Japan, they don't have the Pratimoksha ordinations. They don't have monastic ordinations because in the middle of the 19th century, with the Meiji Restoration, the government, said that all the monks and nuns couldn't keep celibacy anymore and, pushed them all out to marry. And so they don't have the Pratimoksha traditions anymore. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that Japanese Buddhism is bad. It's just they had that historical circumstance. Okay, but then you have people from Japan coming and learning Tibetan Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. One of the people in Venerable Sepel's group actually was a Japanese woman who's studying with a monk in Oregon who is ordained in both the Chinese Buddhist tradition and Theravada. And he's very eager for our monasteries to have a closer connection, because we're both in the Northwest. And his nun needs to be with other nuns sometimes, okay? So, there's all this kind of crossover that's happening, and that's why I think our monastic conferences that we have every year are really very, very important. Where we meet with the monastics. Once a year it happens. We meet with monastics from the different Buddhist traditions, and we become friends and learn about each other's practices and support each other. And I think in the West that's of crucial importance so that we don't propagate all the misconceptions that happened in Asia. Yeah, and that we really learn from and support and help each other. Okay, that's the end of chapter 5.
So the Tibetan Buddhist schools are usually presented as being 4, but what about Jonang and Rime?
Okay, Rime means non-sectarian. So it's supposed to include the other 4, it's supposed to include all 4. Actually, it tends more towards 2 or 3 of them than all 4, and in a way it's become its own tradition. Jonang was in the time of, was it the fifth Dalai Lama? It was really suppressed because it was thought to have some wrong conceptions in it. Yeah, now His Holiness, in the spirit of a communicalism, he's even written a prayer for the existence of the Jonang tradition, but at the same time he'll refute some of their views.
And then
you also have Bon.
Then Bon seems to have been a different religion than it is now.
Yeah, well, Bon initially was kind of a shamanic tradition. It wasn't a formal religion in Tibet. It was a shamanic tradition. And then once Buddhism came, then Bon started adapting certain things from Buddhism. And Buddhism started especially the Nyingma tradition, started adapting certain things from Bon. Yeah. So you have many people with many views and many practices.
The other three schools, the Shakya, Kagyu, and Nyingma, what kind of reasoning practice do they use, and which colleges do they go to?
They have their own shedras, which are colleges, monastic learning institutions that they have. And so in all these settlements in India where there's, major Kagyu, Nyingma, Sakya monasteries, they have the shedras, and people go and learn there. And once in a while, you have somebody from one tradition studying at a shedra or a monastery of another tradition.
And are these studies as elaborate as Gelug studies?
It depends. Actually, I was thinking, and I was going to talk about the 5 major studies, but then I thought, didn't I do that at a BBC? Didn't I talk about the 5 major topics? But then also, I don't think I got around to it at the BBC. In the Nyingma tradition, they study the 5 major topics, but they use 13 texts instead of the 5 or 6 that the Gelus use. Okay? And so it's very interesting to see the texts that the Nyingma lamas use, in their shedra. And they're all texts that the Gelus mention and that are quoted in Gelu sources, but they aren't the ones, the 5 main treatises. Okay? So, for example, Aryadeva's 400, is we know in the Gelu practice is widely studied, but when you come to study Uma, the Madhyamaka tradition, you mainly study Gompa Rabsal and Lekshe Ningbo Tsongkhapa's texts. Okay? But they quote Aryadeva's 400, and then we know we've received teachings from that. Okay? So, kind of like that. The texts, the Vinaya texts by Gunaprabha and Sakyaprabha, the same in all the traditions. The Abbey Dharma Kosha and Vasubandhu's auto commentary, that's studied in all 4 traditions. So a lot of Bodhicharya Avatara, engaging in the Bodhisattva's deeds, that's in all of them. Nagarjuna's in all of them. Aryadeva's in all of them. So, yeah.
Can I repeat? So Panchen Sonam Trakpa has written the textbook for Drepung.
Drepung Losaling.
Drepung Yamyang Shekpa for Gomang.
For Drepung Gomang.
Drepung Gomang and Shuki Kyatsen for Sarah.
Sarah and Ganden Ganden Jangse. And who's Shartse? I should know this. Who wrote Shartse's? I can't remember who wrote Shartse. Somebody can look it up. Yeah, you go online and look it up.
Sorry, and I mean, this is now a bigger topic, but what are kind of the differences of these textbooks?
What?
Are there major differences of these textbooks?
They're very similar, but then they debate the differences because it increases your wisdom and makes you think more. Okay. But it's not like, they're totally different. And like Geshe-la was saying today, if you understand each of the, where each of the textbook commentaries is coming from, then you really see that the topic is basically coming to the same point.
So the monk Dharmapala, who got into trouble because he was debating with Dakinis in his room, it seems like when you're at that level, you would have known that would have been appropriate way in advance. So is this like a teaching meant for the other monks that, if you're hitting this point of practice,
yeah, probably.
off you go.
Yeah.
Do we know where the practice of doing the preliminaries 100,000 times comes from?
I heard that it was from Marpa, but I'm not sure, but that's what I heard. Yeah. And the idea is it gives you 100,000 times to do one with complete sincerity and concentration. Yeah. Okay, but we get really locked in with the numbers and don't do even one with sincerity and concentration.
I also, when you talked about talking about commonalities between traditions, I also found out last year talking about, I took the Admayana precepts at a lay home, and one person was Christian and asking me questions about what kind of precepts I'm taking. So I innocently talked about, I'm not, dancing, not singing, and then not singing, and it was like a shock. And then afterwards, actually, it caused so much de-stress, or I don't know, he was really against.
Yeah.
But then, I shouldn't have talked about it.
And so then you have to say, okay, religious chanting is okay because it inspires you. You have to add that qualification. And then you have to say, have you ever had it happen that you can't get a song out of your mind? And they'll say yes. And then you say, when you're meditating and that happens, it's a real distraction. Yeah. So it's, very often when people ask us questions, it's a way for us to learn. Yeah. And sometimes we can't answer people's questions. So then, then we learn, then I need to go and, ask my teachers or do some reading. And then it's actually quite good. Yeah, we shouldn't expect ourselves to be experts. And when we don't know the answer or we can't satisfy somebody's questions, just say, I'm still studying too. I'm not an expert in this and I need to learn more. And no reason to be ashamed or anything. Mm-hmm. Okay, should we do a little bit more? And start chapter 6, investigating the teachings. Before a wise person buys a needed but costly item, he thoroughly investigates the quality of the product. Okay, so we should make sure we practice this. Yeah? When we buy computers or cars or whatever. Similarly, if we are to invest our time and energy in practicing a path, it is important to investigate the teachings that explain this path and how to practice it. In this chapter, we will examine the factors that make a teaching reliable. Being able to trace a teaching back to the Buddha is a key element in this, so we must know the criteria to do that, especially regarding teachings that have appeared many centuries after the Buddha. Once we have found reliable teachings, our task is to understand them correctly. It's another challenge. Some of us may take all the statements and stories we read in scriptures or hear in oral teachings literally and find them confusing. And this is a big thing in the West. We are so literal. And what they say is often not to be taken literally. It is important to discern the intended purposes of certain statements and the points of particular stories in order to avoid reaching the wrong conclusion. To do this entails taking cultural factors into consideration. Yeah, and really with the stories, especially the ones that Tibetans hear, we can generate such wrong conceptions. Yeah. That's why this chapter was written. Because I went to His Holiness with a lot of those wrong conceptions that people, because I asked people, what kind of questions do you have for His Holiness? And they told me, and then I went and said, and a lot of them were these kinds of things from stories or teachings that were not clear. Since the Buddha's teachings are now spreading in new locations and interacting with unfamiliar cultures, the question arises, is it desirable or possible to change the Dharma teachings? To answer this, it is essential to be able to differentiate the actual Dharma from its cultural forms and expressions. Now, that's the key. If we change the teachings of the path, we will not reach the goal of the path, nirvana. If we do not alter external forms, we may spend a lot of time trying to mimic people from another culture without transforming our minds in any meaningful way. Okay, so here you see it. There's the Dharma and the cultural expressions. If we change the meaning of the Dharma, we're not going to get the same results. We're not going to get to nirvana. We've got to keep the teachings the same. Okay? Regarding cultural expressions, they've got to change, because if we don't change them, we may just copy external things endlessly, but without any transformative effect on our mind. Now, the challenge is telling what is the Dharma from what are the cultural expressions. And the Tibetans, not all of them are good at this, because Tibet never had universities like we had where you study your own culture. They don't know the fields of anthropology or sociology where you study a culture, and see how it operates. So for many of them, they learn Tibetan culture and Buddhism complete in one package. Yeah. And even in Southeast Asia, among the Chinese communities, many people, they just went to the temple with grandma, and at the temple, they had mixed what they called Taoist, which a lot of it is ancestor worship, and Buddhist practice, and they were mixed. And so people didn't know the difference between that. Okay? So a lot of it nowadays, we have to really discern what is what, and what to change and what not to change. And you really see the problems that arise when people change the wrong thing or don't change what needs to be changed. So in a lot of Tibetan centers, the lamas like doing all the pujas in Tibetan because they grew up chanting all the pujas in Tibetan. And it has beautiful melodies, and the lamas understand it. And many Westerners like chanting in Tibetan too, because it's very beautiful and melodious. And you feel kind of holy chanting in another language. Yeah, and you're sitting in the room with the lamas saying the same things, and it feels kind of good and holy. And then you chant all this stuff in Tibetan, and your mind doesn't change at all because you don't understand it. Or maybe the Tibetan's on one side and the English is on the other, but you're so busy reading the Tibetan that you can't read the English. Okay? And then, you've done this whole puja. Yeah, like you did soak puja. And has it become anything more than a picnic of getting food? Or do you like soap puja because then you get some sweets and goodies? Okay? Huh? So, you run into these, and then you run into people who say, well, we don't know. The Buddha just, he talked about rebirth because that was Indian culture, but Buddha didn't really believe rebirth, and then the people who start to change the Dharma. Okay, so, it's, we have to be quite astute regarding this. And for me, when I went to Taiwan to take Bhikshuni ordination in '86, I had been practicing Tibetan Buddhism for 11 years by that time. I had finally managed to, I could do some Tibetan chanting, I could sit for a long time. I went there, I had to stand for a long time doing prayers. They don't sit down, they stand. Yeah? And then everything was in Chinese. They're saying the Great Compassion mantra, and it sounds totally different than ours, except once in a while you hear a few syllables that sound similar. Yeah? And then how they bow is different. Yeah, and learning to bow the Chinese way, and you have to push this aside and hold on to this side and not step on your toes when Yeah. To this day, it gives me problems. What? Yeah. Let's change the subject. So, yes, thank you very much for the yellow. They were great. No, the red ones. Yeah, I use them. During this whole period, because there was very little translation, I had lots of time to think, what was Buddhism and what was culture? And I'm wearing Chinese robes, and and then you have Tibetan robes that are very different. Yeah? What's culture? What am I doing? And so it was very, very fruitful. And it's something that I've continued to think about, as the years go on. Okay, once we become clear on the path and the goal, we have to set about creating the causes necessary to attain full awakening by practicing the path. Okay. Without creating the causes capable of producing a certain result, that result will not come about. So we must be practical and realistic. If we wait until every one of our questions has been answered to our satisfaction, we will miss out on engaging in genuine spiritual practice. Okay? So sometimes, we have 10 zillion questions. We want answers to them all before we even practice one thing. And, while it's good to explore and want to learn things, if we have that outlook, then we'll never practice anything. Yeah? On the other hand, if we don't ask questions and learn, and we just, practice whatever somebody on a flyer teaches us, in the New Age newspaper, then who knows what in the world we're going to wind up practicing. Okay? So we will pause here. I think there's something to think about.
Speaking of culture from the other side point of view, I was astonished one morning at the class at the library. There were a few monks in our class at the Library of Tibetan Works, and one of the monks, who's from Nepal, and he raised his hand and he asked the Geshe, he said, what is the source of the Tibetan prayer flags? And the Geshe said, they are not the Dharma, they are Tibetan culture. And then the whole discussion ensued because apparently in the Himalayas, when they have so many prayer flags hanging together, then animals get caught up them in their horns and they die on the prayer flags, which is a horrible thought. So these monks were just so frustrated that the lay people couldn't let go of the cultural clinging when it was so harmful to sentient beings. So just to hear Tibetan monks talk about that was quite interesting for me. That their own culture, they were willing to say, no, it's not okay.
Yeah.
First, a question from online. Someone says, I facilitate a meditation group in the region. I love that our group can visit the Abbey and invite other group members up as well. However, we get people with all kinds of interests in different practices, Buddhist or elsewhere. How can I reassure them in very simple terms that learning any kind of Buddhism is beneficial, including the teachings of the Abbey? They are often hesitant because of the very beliefs and rumors that Venerable Children mentioned.
Because of the very
reasons that you mentioned, the rumors that you mentioned that about Tibetan Buddhism, about being magical or things like that.
Oh, okay. So people have some of those misconceptions about Tibetan Buddhism. And so this person is leading a group and they want to be able to establish what they're teaching as something valid without people getting tied up in these misconceptions. Is that the question?
How can I reassure them in very simple terms that learning any kind of Buddhism is beneficial, including the teachings of the Abbey? That's the main question.
You tell them to think, listen to the teachings, think about them, analyze them, ask questions. Yeah, see if it makes sense to you. Yeah, and also to practice it and see if it helps. Yeah, and then you will learn through your own experience. The next section we're going to is about the kalamas, and so that will also talk about what to do. But you really this is what impressed me so much is about the teachings, was I was told at the beginning, you don't have to believe anything. You check it out and think about it and see if it makes sense to you. And you practice it and you see if it helps. Yeah? So I think presenting things in that way, then it gives people an open choice and you're not forcing anything on them.
Ask a question about last week's topic?
Hold on a minute. Another way is if people want to know about the Abbey, you can also say that we follow His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Many people respect His Holiness, and so that may ease their concerns as well. Okay, now your question from last week.
Just in terms of how the four Buddha bodies relate to each other, because it's a small point, but they said that they arise simultaneously. But then that the emanation body arises from the enjoyment body.
When it says from, it doesn't mean first the enjoyment body and then the emanation body. You get all of them simultaneously. But because you have the enjoyment body, the emanation body is already, manifests at the same time. Okay. The enjoyment body is a very subtle body. Usually you need something subtle in order to have something gross. Okay? Yeah. And you asked in your thing here, what was it? Okay, so the wisdom truth body is a consciousness, a functioning thing, but not a person. It is the consciousness of a person, the Buddha. Following from this, there must be a Buddha, a person whose mind is the wisdom truth body. However, this Buddha is not the person that is either the enjoyment body or the emanation body. Why not? You think the enjoyment body and emanation body are totally different than the Dharmakaya?
No. But of course I don't. But just the way that it's phrased or the way it's presented, it seems like it's not. I don't know.
Well, you have to also ask, what is your concept of a person?
Yeah.
Yeah? Are you thinking that there's, some guy dressed in flowing robes who says, my mind is the wisdom truth body, the emptiness of that mind is the nature truth body, and then I manifest as somebody else here and somebody else there, but I don't know if they're the same person or not the same person as me. And they wear blue jeans and I'm wearing this robe, and so are we one person, are we different person? Look at how are you grasping at an inherently existent person?
This, I think, where looking at from the tantric point of view, where the subtle wind and subtle mind are everywhere together.
Yeah.
The question about, is that a person as well? Because you do have form and consciousness, which could be pure aggregates. Mm-hmm. So that could be the definition of a person as well.
Yeah.
Which completely
but do you go around saying, hi, Buddha?
Well, exactly. So it's not that stretches the mind to think of what is a person as well.
Yeah, because we have this very rigid idea, a person has a body and a mind and they're right there and we can see them with our eyes. But look at what's the definition of a person? What is merely designated independence on the 4 or 5 aggregates? Yeah?
Thank you.
So it makes you think, what is a person? And our idea of a person, we want to see there he is and see an ID card.
Is there any answer to why there is only one enjoyment body, or is that an Ask a Buddha question?
I think because no enjoyment body is too few and 2 enjoyment bodies are too many. Probably, I was thinking about that. When you have an enjoyment body, you're just a manifestation of the Dharmakaya. You're teaching the Arya Bodhisattvas. The Arya Bodhisattvas can come to you because they can emanate in many different forms to get where you are. You don't need to emanate and go to where they are. Okay? Yeah? Yeah, for once, you're let off the hook, The emanation bodies, boy, they have to work so hard, they have to go here and there, and everybody, wants them to appear when they want them to appear, in the form they want them to appear. But with the enjoyment body, the Arya Bodhisattvas are so flexible, they'll take any appearance, This is the Buddha, they're not picky. Whether the Buddha's green or pink or black or white or purple, the Arya Bodhisattvas don't care. Yes. Or blue or red.
I have a hard time with the Buddha body, so I want to just clarify this one sentence from last week from the text. It says, the nature truth body, which as emptiness and true cessation. So that's the nature truth body has 2 aspects.
Yes.
So that's those 2 aspects.
Yes.
Okay. Is an ultimate truth. It's non-dual with the wisdom truth body. And we said non-dual meant a lack of subject and object.
Here in this case?
In this case.
Yeah, it would mean maybe like not a different entity.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Because the wisdom truth body is a conventional truth. The nature truth body is an ultimate truth.
Yeah, and they're one entity.
Yeah. One nature? Yeah, one nature.
Or one same diff.
Yeah.
So that's not also referring to lack of subject and object?
Well, the wisdom truth body, when it's all the time perceiving the nature truth body. Mm-hmm. So that cognition is non-dual, no subject, no object.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
So it really kind of contains both.
Yeah.
Meanings.
Yeah. It isn't that, okay, here's the Buddha's mind, and it's looking at the emptiness of the Buddha's mind over here, and it says, hi, I'm an inherently existent consciousness apprehending an inherently existent, nature. It's not like that. Uh-huh.
Hey, Jeffrey doesn't even explain it anywhere in Meditation on Emptiness, but he says when he talks about the 5 Buddha bodies, he lists them differently. Because instead of splitting up the nature body, which you did last week, he splits up the Sambhogakaya, he's saying there's an actual enjoyment body and an imputed enjoyment body, such as the body of a 10th ground Bodhisattva. And then he doesn't say anything more in the whole book about that. Okay, I just wondered. I've never heard that. Okay, thank you.
The 10th ground Bodhisattva has to create a pure land so that they can be enlightened in the aspect of the Sambhogakaya in that pure land. So maybe he's saying that 10th ground Bodhisattva is called a Sambhogakaya, but it isn't an actual one yet. That's my guess.
What is the name of Shakyamuni Buddha's Pure Land then? If he has an emanation, enjoyment body in a Pure Land somewhere.
It's called Shakyamuni Buddha's Pure Land.
Isn't that a place in Singapore?
Yeah, it has a sign, kind of, yes, neon, Sakyamuni Buddha's Pure Land. Enter now. Okay, shall we dedicate?